Threads of History, a podcast that aims to go back in time to connect an event or instance to its origin through several threads of continuity across time, space, culture, and historic moments. Welcome to the podcast. I am Mike Shellhammer. Today's episode is on the Israeli Palestinian Conflict, which has an origin in one of the worst conflicts in world history: letters and declarations of a certain island empire, several multinational peacekeeping organizations, a war for independence fought against six foes, and ongoing actions that have increased tensions. Throughout history, the victors of European wars took control of conquered territories as the spoils of war and their well-earned gains. This was especially true of the colonies of defeated European powers, as the winners of the conflict sought to expand their own empires through taking new, far-off territories. However, in the aftermath of the Great War, otherwise known as World War I, historians have remarked on the significant break in this tradition. While Britain, France, Italy, and Japan still retained imperial aspirations, other forces tempered these goals. Those forces included the United States. America emerged as a world power committed to an anti-imperial policy, one that sought to consider the national aspirations of indigenous peoples as well as the imperial agendas of the victors. The November 1918 pre-armistice statement of the Allies affirmed that gaining territory was not their aim and would not be a priority during peace talks. After World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles, the newly formed League of Nations, predecessor of the United Nations, created the Mandate System. The League of Nations was formed on the idea of collective security, or the concept that by working together to ensure the security of all nations, each nation would ensure its own security. At the time, this was a novel approach to international organization and cooperation. Sadly, it would dissolve in the lead-up to World War II. The Mandate System was an attempt to stop the cycle of war and fighting over conquered land by appropriating the land of the collapsed Ottoman Empire and the colonies of the German Empire into the League of Nations, which would decide their governance. In theory, the international community determined that there were different types of territories, and each needed different guidance. There are those that were close to independence, those near to far to independence, and those with virtually no hope of self-determination. These territories would be guided by a larger, established state. It sounds good and fatherly for older countries and empires to help the territories develop into established governments with settled processes. However, in practice, the Mandate System devolved into internationally sanctioned colonialism, where the territories were exploited and used however the administering country desired. Under this system, the victors of World War I were given responsibility for governing former German and Ottoman territories as mandates from the League. The ultimate goal was development of each mandate towards eventual independence. This goal was tempered, some would argue, by the fact that mandates were awarded with full consideration of both public and secret agreements made during the war. For the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 and the Balfour Declaration of 1917 helped structure the division of Ottoman territories between France and Britain. Let's explain the latter of those agreements made during the war, the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was more a public statement than an actual agreement between two parties, and it was issued by the British government in 1917, announcing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which was then an Ottoman region with a small minority Jewish population. The declaration was contained in a letter dated 2nd of November 1917 from the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, for transmission to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. The text of the declaration was published in the press 7 days later. The opening words of the declaration represented the first public expression of support for Zionism by a major political power. Zionism was the movement of those of Jewish ancestry to be resettled in the same area of the historic kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The term national home had no precedent in international law and was intentionally vague as to whether a Jewish state was contemplated. The intended boundaries of Palestine were not specified, and the British government later confirmed that the words "in Palestine" meant that the Jewish national home was not intended to cover all of Palestine. The second half of the declaration was added to satisfy opponents of the policy who had claimed that it would otherwise prejudice the position of the local population of Palestine and encourage anti-Semitism worldwide by stamping the Jews as strangers in their native lands. The declaration called for safeguarding the civil and religious rights for the Palestinian Arabs, who compose the vast majority of the local population, and also the rights and political status of the Jewish communities in other countries outside Palestine. But, notably, it did not ensure the political rights of the current residents in Palestine to their own land. The declaration had many long-lasting consequences. It greatly increased popular support for Zionism within Jewish communities worldwide, and became a core component of the British Mandate for Palestine, which is the founding document of Mandatory Palestine, and would later become Israel and the Palestinian territories. Although few would have predicted it in the early 1920s, all the Class A mandates, those that were closest to independence, did achieve independence as provided under the conditions of the mandates. Only Palestine was left to the United Nations under its trusteeship program, and in 1947, Britain presented this thorny problem to the UN General Assembly for resolution. The British had controlled Palestine for almost 3 decades under the mandate system, overseeing a succession of protests, riots, and revolts by the Jewish and Palestinian Arab communities. After the general disarray and uncertainty during World War II, the newly formed United Nations would create a resolution to the Mandate for Palestine. The United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine was passed on November 29, 1947. This plan called for the creation of separate Jewish and Arab states operating under economic union, and with Jerusalem and Bethlehem transferred to UN trusteeship. 2 weeks later, Colonel Secretary Arthur Creech Jones announced that the British Mandate would terminate on the 15th of May, 1948. On the last day of the Mandate, the creation of the State of Israel was proclaimed, and the 1948 Arab-Israeli War began, which was a de facto war for independence by the Israelis. It would seem that the current ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be traced back to the emergence of this Jewish state, which was brought on by the Balfour Declaration and the support of Zionism in Britain and other countries. So let's talk more about this war for independence for Israel. The 1948, or sometimes called First Arab-Israeli War, was at the end of a years-long period of insurgency and civil unrest in Palestine. It formally began following the end of the British Mandate for Palestine at midnight on May 14, 1948. The Israeli Declaration of Independence had been issued earlier that day, and a military coalition of Arab states entered the territory of British Palestine on the morning of the 15th. It is unfortunately clear that British policies dissatisfied both Arabs and Jews while they were in charge of the Mandate of Palestine. Arab opposition developed into the 1936-1939 Arab Revolt, while the Jewish opposition developed into the 1944-1947 Jewish insurgency. It was Britain's failure in Palestine that helped to bring about this conflict, because they could not broker a mutually advantageous solution, allowing for Jews and Palestinians to coexist in Palestine. The dual obligation to the two communities was untenable and should have been solved. The British even concluded that it was impossible for them to pacify the two communities in Palestine by using different messages for different audiences, which was supporting Zionism while also supporting those living in Palestine during the Mandate. The Palestine Royal Commission, in making the first official proposal for partition of the region, referred to the requirements as contradictory obligations, and that the problem is so deep-rooted that the only hope of a solution would require a careful and exact operation. Following many years of Arab revolts in Palestine and as worldwide tensions rose in the build-up to the Second World War, the British Parliament approved the White Paper of 1939, their last formal statement of governing policy in Mandatory Palestine, declaring that Palestine should not become a Jewish state and placing restrictions on Jewish immigration. While the British considered this consistent with the Balfour Declaration's commitment to protect the rights of non-Jews, many Zionists saw it as a reversal to the declaration. Although this policy only lasted until the British surrendered the mandate in 1948, it served to highlight the fundamental difficulty for Britain in carrying out the mandate obligations. Britain's involvement in this became one of the most controversial parts of the empire's history and damaged its reputation in the Middle East for generations. According to historian Elizabeth Munro, quote, "Measured by British interests alone, it is one of the greatest mistakes in imperial history," unquote. A 2010 study done by Jonathan Schneer, specialist in modern British history at Georgia Tech, concluded that because the build-up to the Balfour Declaration was characterized by contradictions, deceptions, misinterpretations, and wishful thinking, that it would only result in disaster. The foundational stone for modern Israel was laid by the British support for an Israeli state, as it is laid out in the Balfour Declaration, at least tacitly. But any prediction that this would lay the groundwork for decent Arab-Jewish cooperation was clearly wishful thinking. In the absence of the British mandate, and with the establishment of the State of Israel, tensions would erupt into widespread and open conflict as a result of these events. There was ongoing civil war following the 29th November 1947 adoption by the United Nations of the Partition Plan for Palestine. The first deaths of this war occurred in November 1947 during an ambush of two buses carrying Jews. A more conventional war would come months later. We'll now lay out some of the details of this first Arab-Israeli war. On May 15, 1948, Egypt, Transjordan, or would otherwise be known as Jordan, Syria, and expeditionary forces from Iraq entered Palestine. In the end, 6 different nations, with those previously mentioned joined by Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, were in armed conflict with the newly independent country. The invading forces took control of the Arab areas and immediately attacked Israeli forces and several Jewish settlements. 10 months of fighting would take place, mostly on the territory of the British Mandate and in the Sinai Peninsula in southern Lebanon, though the war was interrupted by several truce periods within those 10 months. Israeli forces were able to maintain their independence and defeat the coalition of Arab countries who attacked them. As a result of the war, the State of Israel controlled the area that the UN had proposed for the Jewish state, as well as almost 60% of the area proposed for the Arab state, including Jaffa, Lydda, and Ramleh areas, Galilee, some parts of the Negev, a wide strip along the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road, and some territories in the West Bank. Israel also took control of West Jerusalem, which was meant to be part of an international zone for Jerusalem and its environs. Jordan took control of East Jerusalem and the remainder of the former British Mandate, annexing it the following year, and the Egyptian military took control of the Gaza Strip. At the Jericho Conference on December 1, 1948, 2,000 Palestinian delegates called for unification of Palestine with Jordan as a step towards full Arab unity. The First Arab-Israeli War triggered significant demographic changes throughout the Middle East. Around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes in the areas that became Israel, becoming refugees because of what they refer to as the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. That represents more than half of the Arab population in the former Mandate of Palestine. More than 400 Arab villages and about 10 Jewish villages and neighborhoods were depopulated during the Arab-Israeli War. According to estimates based on earlier censuses, the total Muslim population in Palestine was a little more than 1.1 million in 1947. After the war, around 156,000 Arabs remained in Israel and even became Israeli citizens. Palestinian refugees were settled in Palestinian refugee camps throughout the Arab world. The United Nations established the UN Relief and Works Agency as a relief and human development agency tasked with providing humanitarian assistance to Palestinian refugees. Arab nations refused to absorb Palestinians, instead keeping them in refugee camps while insisting that they be allowed to return to Palestine at a future date. Refugee status was also passed on to their descendants, who were largely denied citizenship in Arab states, except in Jordan. The Arab League instructed its members to deny Palestinian citizenship, quote, to avoid disillusion of their identity and protect their right of return to their homeland, unquote. More than 1.4 million Palestinians still live in 58 recognized refugee camps, while more than 5 million Palestinians live outside Israel and the Palestinian territories. The Palestinian refugee problem and debate about the Palestinian right of return are major issues in the current Arab-Israeli conflict. During the 1948 war, around 10,000 Jews were forced to evacuate their homes from Arab-dominated parts of former Mandatory Palestine. However, in the 3 years following the war, almost 1 million Jews emigrated to Israel. Many of the new immigrants settled along the borders and in former Arab lands of Palestine. This influx of people doubled the Jewish population in the area. Of these, upwards of 300,000 arrived from Asian and North African states. The largest group, over 100,000, came from Iraq. The remaining 700,000 came mostly from Europe, including more than 136,000 displaced Jews living in refugee camps and urban centers in Germany, Austria, and Italy. In addition, more than 270,000 Jews had emigrated from Eastern Europe, mainly Romania and Poland. Upon the establishment of the new state, a top priority was given to the policy for the ingathering of the exiles, and the new government gave key assistance to the Jewish Agency to organize immigrants from Europe and the Middle East and arrange for their transport to Israel. For David Ben-Gurion, a national leader in the war for Israeli independence and Israel's first prime minister, a fundamental defect of the state was that it, quote, lacked Jews, unquote. Jewish immigrants from Arab and Muslim countries left for numerous reasons. The war's outcome had exacerbated Arab hostilities to local Jewish communities. News of the victory aroused messianic expectations in Libya and Yemen. Zionism had taken root in many countries. Active incentives for making Aliyah formed a key part of Israeli policy, and better economic prospects and security were to be expected from a Jewish state. Some Arab governments, Egypt for example, held their Jewish communities hostage at times. Persecution, political instability, and news of a number of violent pogroms also played a role. Some 800,000 to 1 million Jews eventually left the Arab world over the next 3 decades as a result of these various factors. Approximately 680,000 of them emigrated to Israel, where the rest had settled in France or the Americas. It seems that displacement and resentment sparks many of these conflicts throughout this thread of history. It's no wonder many people feel so hurt and disgruntled by the actions on both sides of this conflict. As Israel began to set itself up as a legitimate nation-state, it had to deal with this influx of immigrants. Israel initially relied on the Jewish Agency-run immigrant camps to accommodate displaced Jews. In the 1950s, these were transformed into transition camps, where living conditions were improved, and tents were replaced with tin dwellings. Unlike the situation in the immigrant camps, when the Jewish Agency provided for the immigrants, residents of the transition camps were required to provide for themselves. These camps began to decline in 1952, 4 years after independence, with the last one closing over a decade later. The camps were largely transformed into permanent settlements, known as development towns, while the remainder were absorbed as new neighborhoods of the towns they were attached to. Most development towns would eventually grow into cities. Some Jewish immigrants were also given the vacant homes of Palestinian refugees, with the tacit understanding that the former owners would not be returning. Over the decades since the First Arab-Israeli War, multiple wars and less conventional conflicts have erupted between the people living in Israel and those in bordering countries. These conflicts have been characterized by multiple power sharing and cooperative government failures, as well as incredibly entrenched animosity between the ruling Jews and the Arab minority, as well as between the nation of Israel and its Arab neighbors, many of whom still housed Palestinian refugees. Some of the well-known figures in these conflicts include the Israeli armed forces and their parliament, and various governmental and military factions within the Palestinian community. The factions jockeying for control how Palestinians are represented, including the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, the Palestinian National Authority, or more simply the Palestinian Authority, PA or PNA, Fatah, and Hamas, which are both political parties. The PLO is a Palestinian nationalist political and militant organization founded in 1964 with the purpose of establishing Arab unity and liberating Palestinian territories under military occupation by the State of Israel. It is headquartered in the West Bank and is recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people by over 100 countries that it holds diplomatic relations with. The United Nations continues to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the representative of the Palestinian people. Many political factions exist within the PLO. Among them are Hamas and Fatah, which is heavily involved in the administration of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian National Authority, or officially referred to by themselves as the State of Palestine, is the government body that exercises partial civil control over urban and rural Palestinian communities in the West Bank as a consequence of the 1993-1995 Oslo Accords. The Palestinian Authority also controlled the Gaza Strip prior to a Palestinian election in 2006 and a subsequent Gaza conflict between Fatah and Hamas political parties, when Fatah lost control of parliament to Hamas for more than a year. Hamas is probably the more widely known group, other than the PLO, in the United States. Hamas is a Palestinian Sunni Islamic fundamentalist, militant, and nationalist political organization. Israel and Hamas have engaged in several wars of varying intensity, all while Hamas was considered to be illegitimate and not a true representative organization for Palestinians as a whole. Palestinians' military wing has launched attacks against Israeli civilians and soldiers, often describing them as retaliations, in particular for assassinations of the upper echelon of their leadership. Tactics have included suicide bombings and, since 2001, rocket attacks. Hamas's rocket arsenal, though mainly consisting of short-range, homemade rockets with a range of 10 miles, also includes missiles that have longer ranges up to 25 miles. These longer-range rockets have reached major Israeli towns such as Beersheba and Ashdod, and some have struck cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa. It is important to remember the human cost in these conflicts. Human Rights Watch has condemned as war crimes and crimes against humanity both Hamas and Israel for attacks on civilians during the ongoing conflict, stating that the rationale of reprisals is never valid when civilians are the ones who are being targeted. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Palestinian elections in 2006 were a major turning point in the powers jockeying for control of Palestine. In January of that year, Palestinian parliamentary elections resulted in Hamas winning a majority in the Palestinian Authority parliament, defeating the PLO-affiliated Fatah party. After these elections, the Quartet, which is otherwise known as the European Union, Russia, the United Nations, and the United States, made future foreign assistance to the PA conditional upon their authorities' commitment to nonviolence, recognition of the State of Israel, and the acceptance of previous agreements. Hamas, now in control of the Palestinian Authority, rejected those conditions, which led the Quartet to suspend its foreign assistance program and Israel to impose economic sanctions on the Hamas-led administration. In March 2007, a national unity government headed by Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas was briefly formed, but this failed to restart international financial assistance. Israel and Egypt then imposed an economic blockade on the Gaza Strip, on the grounds that Fatah forces were no longer providing security there. In fact, it was Hamas that was providing security, or potentially the lack of security. The political arms of Hamas and Fatah attempted to reconcile a number of times since 2006 elections. The first reconciliation agreement was reached in 2011, but failed to bring about much change. A new deal in 2014, in which Hamas agreed to hand over administration of the Gaza Strip to a unity government of the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah, also failed to bring about a significant change. It was not until a 2017 agreement that the PA was able to take control of public institutions in the Gaza Strip, though full control was never achieved, and the PA withdrew from Gaza as a result. Throughout the decades, the PLO, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority have made bids for statehood recognition, with one made in 2012 that gained a form of recognition at the UN. The president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, announced that he would seek the UN General Assembly's implicit recognition of Palestinian statehood by submitting a draft resolution requesting that the status of the Palestinian mission to the UN, which is officially called Palestine within the UN, be upgraded from permanent observer to non-member observer state. The designation, though falling short of full UN membership, would allow Palestinians to seek membership in the international bodies such as the International Criminal Court. The resolution passed on November 29, 2012, with 138 countries in favor, 9 opposed, and 41 abstentions. The resolution also urged Israel and the Palestinians to resume stalled negotiations toward a two-state solution. Israeli officials opposed Abbas's bid for recognition, saying that such unilateral actions by the Palestinians would hold up negotiations with them. It's important to note the contributions of the Israelis to this ongoing conflict. Much animosity stems from the construction of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and a refusal to allow Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, while also limiting the rights of Palestinians in Israeli-controlled areas. As a result, this conflict has brought in the international community, often through actions in the UN, as we just mentioned, but also through attempted peace treaties and negotiations regarding humanitarian, military, and other aid. In 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump began touting that his administration was devising an ultimate deal peace initiative for the Israelis and the Palestinians. The initial optimism with which the Palestinian Authority received Trump and his promised initiative was soon snuffed out by the decision of the United States to move its embassy in Israel to the contested city of Jerusalem in 2018. The United States also began to cut funding to the Palestinian Authority and to aid programs for Palestinians, and ordered the closure of the PLO office in Washington, D.C. The peace plan, released in 2 parts in 2019 and 2020, included predetermined solutions that proposed significant development in the Palestinian territories, but favored Israel on most of the contentious issues. President Trump's plan was called the deal of the century by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but it was dismissed by the Palestinians as incredibly one-sided. No negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis took place during Trump's presidency as a result of this problematic plan. It's also important to note that President Trump's administration took 3 years to roll out the plan, and he was ousted as president in the November 2020 elections in the United States. The inauguration of the new U.S. president in 2021 brought hope of a rapprochement between the PA and the United States. Indeed, the United States began restoring aid to the Palestinian Authority and vowed to reopen the PLO office in Washington, D.C. President Abbas announced plans to hold parliamentary elections in May and presidential elections in July of that year, which many observers believed were intended to shore up the legitimacy of the Abbas-led government, while also signaling resolve to the renewed peace process. In late April, however, Abbas postponed the elections indefinitely, amid concerns that Israel would prevent voting in East Jerusalem, a reason cited for the cancellation of elections in the past, which means that Abbas continues to hold power in the PA and PLO. There are a number of issues which Israel and the Palestinians cannot agree on, and I am no expert, but I'm going to try to cover them as best I can. These include what should happen to Palestinian refugees, whether Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank should stay or be removed, whether the two sides should share Jerusalem, and perhaps the most contentious of all, whether a Palestinian state should be created alongside Israel. Most Palestinian refugees and their descendants live in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as in neighboring Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Neither they nor their descendants have been allowed by Israel to return to their homes. Israel says this would overwhelm the country and threaten its existence as a Jewish state. Israel still occupies the West Bank, and although it pulled out of Gaza, the UN still regards that piece of land as occupied territory. Israel claims the whole of Jerusalem as its capital, while the Palestinians claim East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state. The U.S. is one of only a handful of countries to recognize the city as Israel's capital. And that may or may not have changed with the change in administration in 2021. Israel has built settlements in occupied areas where more than 600,000 Jews now live. Palestinians say these are illegal under international law and are obstacles to peace, but Israel obviously denies this. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank say they are suffering because of Israeli actions and restrictions. Israel says it is only acting to protect itself from Palestinian violence. Peace talks have been taking place on and off for more than 25 years, but so far have not solved the conflict. Any future peace deal would need both sides to agree to resolve these very complex issues. And it's clear that these deep-seated animosities and resentments will not easily be set aside. For more than 70 years, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has affected the Middle East landscape. A comprehensive diplomatic solution has defied international efforts, leaving people disillusioned about the prospect of peace. Large-scale violence ebbs and flows, leaving communities insecure and enabling the conflict to persist as a rallying tool for extreme actors, continuing international attention. There is hope that regional geopolitical shifts could offer a new opening to forge progress towards Israeli-Palestinian and broader regional conflict resolution. The United States Institute for Peace has worked to strengthen diplomatic peacemaking efforts, empowering Palestinian and Israeli civil society actors who are working to build trust within and between their societies, to enhance community security for Israelis and Palestinians, and to build institutional capabilities that prepare the ground for a just, peaceful, and sustainable solution to the conflict. There are various United Nations initiatives and analyses that have tried to mitigate the worst of the conflict and bring together Palestinians and Israelis. Resolving this long-standing conflict requires a package of parallel measures by the two sides, with the help of the international community. A broader package of parallel steps by the government of Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and the international community is needed, and such a framework should begin to address key political, security, and economic challenges that are preventing this progress. An example of a problem that is preventing progress is the fact that Israeli authorities continue to consider new settlement construction between the northern and southern West Bank, which has been acting to undermine the chances for establishing a viable and contiguous Palestinian state as part of a negotiated two-state resolution. There is an absence of accountability for Israel and for any protection for the Palestinian people, which has enabled Israel to tread over the rights of an entire nation and allowed for the perpetuation of a permanent settler colonial occupation. It is clear that peace is not achieved by normalizing the occupation, sidelining the Palestinians, or rewarding Israel by repositioning it as a regional superpower. In fact, UN Council members have spoken out against Israel's illegal settlement activities and even the demolitions of Palestinians' homes, as well as attacks waged against each other,
Some pointed to the reconstruction of Gaza as an urgent priority, spotlighting the crucial role to be played by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees and its funding shortage. The UN has tried to leverage its soft power to include the Palestinians in the broader dialogue and use the regional dynamic to restart negotiations between the two parties. It's clear that this complex interplay between Palestinian factions and their varied philosophical, militant movements and the unsympathetic Israeli government have muddied the waters on what actions might ever end this conflict. Sadly, no one may ever be happy with the arrangement, if one can ever be found. This ongoing battle between the Palestinians and Israelis has its origin in the aftermath of the First World War, the Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate and the United Nations, the fight for Israeli independence, and the current animosity between those in Israel and Palestine.
Thank you for listening to episode 7 on the Israeli Palestinian conflict. This has been Threads of History. I am Mike Shellhammer. Thank you for listening. You can email your comments and suggestions to threads.historypodcast@gmail.com. Listen to more Threads of History on Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify.